Swastika Arulingam. Good morning, and thank you for joining me to talk about the legal aspects of what's happening today, framed within the Aragalaya movement. Because I must tell you, I never regretted not being a lawyer than I do now, okay? Because when things happen, when I watch things unfold, right, I always feel I wish I knew the legal aspects of what's happening, because some things are clearly not allowed in a democracy, some things are clearly breaking the law. But again, I get thrown back into things I don't know about the legal aspect. And today I invited you mainly to ask the space given for protest under emergency law, right? Because we roughly have an idea of what democracy is and what's allowed within that. But I think some citizens don't quite understand what it means to have emergency declared. And thereby, what does that mean for protesters? What rule are we now breaking, which wasn't illegal before? Things like that. So let me step back and ask you, in a democracy, what is the role of protest if there is no emergency? I know that's a right. Can we just have the legal interpretation of that?
In terms of protests, our constitution, the constitution of Sri Lanka, gives us two rights. One right is called the freedom of assembly, which means we have a right to gather in places. The other right, which is given in our fundamental rights chapter, is the right to expression and the right to speech. So, and also the right to thought, conscience, and religion. So all of this combined together, where we can actually gather in a place and we can think without any kind of restriction, and then we can also express and also speak. All of this combined together gives us the right to protest through our constitution. This is apart from the fact that there are also certain trade union rights in our constitution. If you're part of the trade union, then you also have a right to join that trade union, and that also flows, certain action flows from it. So all of this combined together, which comes in our fundamental rights chapter, gives us a right to gather, give us the right to protest and peaceful demonstrations and so on. Now, the fundamental rights chapter of the constitution also places certain restrictions on these fundamental rights, not on the right to think and not on the right to conscience, but on the right to speech and on the right to assembly, where if in a time of public emergency or in a time of public, there is an emergency or a need for it, certain restrictions can be put on these fundamental rights. But courts have consistently held that it has to be proportionate. You can't blanketly, the state or the government can't blanketly deny people the right to speak and the right to assembly.
Okay, so when you see emergency, Swastika, you mean the declaration of emergency in a country or an urgent situation? You meant the emergency law in the country, right?
So usually when there is an urgent situation, the president has a right to declare emergency. And when he has a right to declare emergency, he also has a right to frame emergency regulations.
Okay.
So it is through these emergency regulations that these restrictions are brought in. Right. But again, it has to be proportionate. It can't be a blanket restriction on these rights.
Correct. And what does it mean exactly for someone, for example, the Galle Face Aragalaya, under emergency law? Then does that become illegal? Or do we have to take a case-by-case contextual judgment on that? Because you said you can't have a blanket law. You can't have blanket rule on something. So let's take the specific, the gathering and the right speech that the Aragalaya people did. Would that then become illegal?
So under the current emergency regulations, which was promulgated in July 2022, the emergency regulations places certain restrictions. The president can bring in certain restrictions on gatherings. The police can place certain time-bound restrictions on where people can gather in certain places. So the police can say that we can't gather in Galle Face, but it has to be time-bound. And then also certain areas can become restricted for people to gather and so on. So these kind of emergency regulations which exist today can become an issue for people to gather in Galle Face and protest, or people to gather in even in another place and protest, because these are now emergency regulations in existence, and we violate those emergency regulations, penalties can be put on us, which can be quite harsh. So that is what currently which is in existence.
So Swastika, if the protesters are not bothering anyone, because I agree even without knowing law that no one human being has a right to bother or trouble or hurt another, right? If the Aragalaya was not hurting anyone technically, physically, except maybe people's reputations elsewhere, is it possible we can't then question the law that tells them to disperse had it not been harmful? Cannot be questioned if there's emergency.
So that is the problem with the whole situation of emergency. It is of course a legal situation, but still that's a problem with the situation. The Public Security Ordinance, it's called the Public Security Ordinance, which was enacted even before independence, was a law which gave the president or the executive sweeping powers to place many restrictions on the rights of citizens. Almost he was given blanket authority to do this. So in the past presidents, what they have done is they've used this power to place a lot of restrictions, including removing a lot of protections which are granted to citizens, particularly when it comes to arrest and detention. So the problem, the current emergency regulations, the problem we have right now is that anything and everything can be construed as an offense by the police as well as the armed forces. So even let's, for instance, you're going to Galle Face and you're you got to go to Galle Face with your boyfriend, and you sit on the beach and you're just eating ice cream or something. If the authorized officer wants, authorized officer is a person, again we are not sure who the authorized officer is, but if you look at an interpretation, it can mean a person authorized by the commander of the armed forces. That person can come and arrest you for what he construes as public indecency. So basically, under this current emergency regulations, anything and everything can be construed as an offense, and that the discretion of what is an offense or what is not an offense is entirely in the hands of who is arresting. And once you get arrested, then up to 14 days, the DIG, the police DIG, can technically keep you in custody without even producing you to court. So that is why these emergency regulations is considered to be extremely draconian and very unsafe for democracy.
I was thinking that sounds like, the earlier kingdom, the king can just, okay, I don't like this, off with his head kind of thing. Tell me, Swastika, is this a worldwide accepted thing? Can any country do this anywhere in the world, in the democratic world, and have this kind of draconian behavior or law? Is it only this part of the world that has this kind of law, or is it common to any part of the world? This.
So in countries like Pakistan and India also, in several countries in South Asia, the governments have ruled when certain insurgencies or certain situations have arisen, the government has ruled and they have declared a state of emergency, and they have used that state of emergency to impose military law, to impose the military on the people, and several human rights violations, including disappearances, have occurred. But the theorization of emergency, which is not very relevant to us, we can trace back to World War II, where there was a German legal scholar called Carl Schmitz, and he theorizes this concept called a state of exception. And he says the person who can declare the state of exception is the sovereign of the country. So he was trying to argue and say, because it was the chancellor, it was Hitler who can declare the state of exception or the state of emergency, he is the actual sovereign of a country. So that theory, of course, several people have developed later on, even in other European countries and so on. But the state of emergency or state of exception, which for me is seen as something which is outside the law, and which is seen as where a president or a very powerful executive can use that power to surpass the law, to surpass the judiciary, has in some instances been classified as something special and something extraordinary by certain legal scholars. But I would see this as a state, as a place in law where one person is given so much power to control and to bend the law according to his will and fancy. So that is how I would see the state of emergency.
Yes, and I think it's very significant that whoever theorized it used the word sovereign, no? Because that's absolutely what it is. And has this not been challenged? Now, you personally might feel this is not legal, though it is put into law. Has this never been challenged as a question? Rephrase: have the laws that are enforced in emergency never been challenged by others, Swastika? Because it seems as if there is no. For me, that the definition you gave seems technically to say there's technically no law. Subjectively, if they consider you breaking the law, you're guilty. Has no one challenged the state of emergency laws themselves?
So in the past, there has been several Supreme Court judgments where when people have been subjected to certain very broad sweeping emergency regulation, people have citizens and people have gone before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has said emergency, this does not mean absolute discretion. It has to be reasonable, it has to be proportionate to the situation and so on. But again, it is after the emergency has been declared, and when there is a violation, let's say someone is detained and tortured, or someone is unfairly arrested and they go before the Supreme Court, then the Supreme Court has held that it is disproportionate to the situation at hand, and so on. But even this emergency, human rights activists and also a former human rights commissioner, Ambika Satkunanandan, has challenged this declaration of emergency. And I don't know the basis on which she has gone about, but she has challenged it. The problem with challenging, for me at least, the problem with challenging the entire declaration of emergency and the emergency regulation is that once the president declares a state of emergency, he has to put it to parliament within 14 days. And the parliament has to approve the emergency. So then it becomes a legal instrument which is also sanctioned by the parliament. And then it becomes a bit technically difficult to challenge it in court, because the court always says the parliament is the will of the people, because these are people, 225 people who are voted by the people. Right. So they would, the court has been more ready to challenge, let's say, an executive action rather than a legislative action. So that has been the challenge to challenge the entire framework of emergency. But emergency regulations, when it has been, particularly when armed forces and the police have overstepped certain fundamental protections, the court has stepped in to protect the rights of the people. But of course, after the violation has happened.
Exactly. I won't even get to how this would have affected the northern, the northern problems. I would not get to how the 88, 89, how many people would have suffered. We know enough about disappearances and the mothers' fronts that still haven't found closure. And I've read Ambika, I know her feelings about that. But let's get to right now. Is it possible, Swastika, for the rule to apply now and go back in time and then say you were doing something wrong at that time and penalize someone for that? Is it possible to project this backwards and get people arrested now?
It's not possible to retrospectively or look backward and arrest someone and say that on this day you had, let's for instance, on May 9th, there was no emergency. But you know that there were several property, including vehicles and houses, which were set on fire. So it's not possible to go back to May 9th and say, frame that person under how emergency regulations have been framed. But if you look at the scope of the emergency, what was declared in July this year, if you look at the scope of the emergency and the offenses which have been brought under this emergency, for me, when I read that emergency, it almost looks as if they have brought in to protect the properties and the houses of people in power.
Okay, so it can change, you're saying. When you declare emergency, the things that are offenses are not set. It can change according to whatever the authorities want. Is that the case?
So the emergency regulations can be newly drafted also. So it's not a set of emergency regulations which is imposed again and again. So the emergency regulations which exist today might not be the emergency regulations which exist tomorrow. So emergency is something which the president declares, and then the emergency regulation kind of sets the legal framework on how the emergency is going to be administered or governed.
Right. So it's a case by case thing, depending on the context of those countries. I see. Okay. Right. So within that, so they declared emergency before people went to the president's house and all that, or after?
So they declared emergency, I believe, soon after Ranil Wickremesinghe became acting president. He became acting president. So that was on the day which Gotabaya Rajapaksa gave his resignation. So he became acting president. So it was on that day that Ranil Wickremesinghe first declared a state of emergency. And I believe on that day, when he declared a state of emergency, people had, if my memory holds correctly, people have gone on the streets and protested. People have gone into public buildings and so on. So those things can be framed as coming under the emergency regulations.
I see. Okay. Right. Swastika, now that you clarified it, now people, I think, it's very, the waters are very muddy and we don't quite know what's going on. But even yesterday, somebody was, taken in. What are the legal processes they have to get through? Let me cut this in two pieces. Now, when someone is arrested, it has to be the state arm that arrests legally, right? It has to be the police or somebody. Okay.
It has to be the police or the a member of the armed force.
Armed forces, right. In that case, what are the steps that someone can take? They are taken in, and what is the process in which they are, in which lawyers can help?
So the advice I usually give people is not written in a law book, because right now what is happening, particularly in the last 2 weeks, is that people have been just picked off the street by unknown men, and
yes,
then they are
that was going to be the second one. So let's take it in two steps. Has it also happened legally?
Yes. So if a person few days back, a person was legally arrested under the emergency regulations, where he was asked to come to a police station. His statement was recorded, and then the CID arrested him under the emergency regulations. In that case, if it is happening legally, what I always say is, when you are summoned to the police station, you have to either go with a lawyer or you go with a witness. So you go with another person. You never go alone to a police station or to an army camp or anywhere. Even if the police summons you, you go at a time when it's convenient for you, and you go at a time, not like, let's say the police summons you today at 9 o'clock, you can go at 11 o'clock. You can't abscond and then go like 3 days later. But you always keep enough people informed. You keep lawyers informed, and preferably you go with lawyers, so that in the situation the lawyer is able to advise you on what to say and what not to say, and so on. So I always say this to clients: when you are summoned to police station, or when you are summoned to a place of law enforcement, whether it be police stations, and I have not seen anyone being summoned to army camps, so it's mostly police stations, you inform a lawyer and keep. Preferably you go with a lawyer, or in the least you at least go with a witness, so that if you are arrested, then they can at least inform lawyers and other people, and they can follow up on the case. And the second thing which I say is, if you're arrested, immediately inform the Human Rights Commission, irrespective of whether they are going to release you or release you on bail or not. Keep the Human Rights Commission informed, because under the emergency, you can technically be kept up to 72 hours without even informing the magistrate. And if there is a detention order from the DIG, you can be kept up to 2 weeks. So you always keep the Human Rights Commission informed, so that they can check up on you and possibly prevent you from any kind of physical torture, particularly any kind of physical torture. So always keep the Human Rights Commission informed.
how do they do that? Are they allowed to make phone calls when they're arrested or before?
So what happens is, under the emergency, unfortunately, there's a provision which says that the police can seize property from you. So what I have been seeing in the last 2 weeks is that the moment you're arrested, the police takes the phone away from you. That's the first thing they do. They take the phone away from you. They ask for your passport and so on. So that is why it's always important to go with another person, so that even if you're arrested, that person is able to call the Human Rights Commission and inform the Human Rights Commission. Or in the list, there is an online application which you can fill and send a complaint to the Human Rights Commission. But usually there's a Human Rights Commission hotline. I'm not right now off my head, I can't remember the number, but there's a hotline you can find online, and you can inform the Human Rights Commission that so and so person has been arrested.
And they'll be taking applications or requests in all 3 languages, right? Sinhala, Tamil, or English?
You can complain and make an application in all 3 languages.
All 3 languages. Okay, right. Now that seems very, very open and at least within the legality. But what bothers me, and I think I probably am older than you, I have seen what happened as a child in the 80s. What happens is, when the process of arrest doesn't happen through the state mechanisms, or at least not outwardly, when plainclothes men come and bundle you into something. What is that? Because see, that what bothers me about that swastika is the state can always say nothing to do with us, right? Underworld is now active. We don't know, we are worried, it's active. So I mean, it could be something personal, it could be the underworld, but it could also be, like we all know, every state has people in t-shirts who are working for the states, but we have no way of identifying. In that case, for me, that is the most dangerous thing. What happens, Swastika?
So as you said, that is the most dangerous thing, because we also have a history of, as you mentioned before, we also have a history of disappearances. And in the last few days, particularly student activists have been basically abducted. Like, there's no process, men in civil clothing come and they have abducted. Thankfully, for many of them, they were witnesses, so we knew what was happening and so on. So in that case, at least now they are abducting these people in vehicles with number plates. So one of the first thing I say is record the number plate, because once you know the number plate, it's not, at least you have a legal hold. If something happens, you have a legal hold. So whoever who is standing next to you needs to record the number plate. If you're on your own and if you get abducted, there is very little protection, because they take the phone away from you. And I mean, unfortunately, there is very little protection for you if you're alone and you're abducted. But if you have any indication that particularly if you have been leading the struggle, or you have been actively part of the struggle or so on, at least for the next few months, at least until the emergency is defeated in Parliament, that's something which we have to talk later, but at least until that point, I would say travel with people. Don't travel alone, always be with people. So at least even if you're abducted, then someone is able to raise it in various forums and search for you. And this is what happened in the last 3 cases of abductions, where fortunately they had a witness. In one of the instances, the witness have taken the number plate of the jeep which has taken the boy. So we were immediately able to raise awareness on social media and inform that this person has gone missing immediately. Then of course inform the Human Rights Commission. Through our contacts, inform the Bar Association. We also inform the police, and we got the media to start asking questions from the police as to where this particular person is. So usually, even with all of that, the police in the start, for instance, a few days back when a boy was abducted, for around 7 hours, the police just misinforming or misleading lawyers and even the Human Rights Commission in terms of where this person is kept. But still, because we were able to raise the alarm quickly, the state could not avoid liability or deny liability, because we kept on, basically lawyers and the Human Rights Commission kept on hounding the state until the information is obtained. So if that is the state of the case, the only advice I could give is always travel with other people, always travel with witnesses, and that would be the best protection for you, because this is something extra legal. So despite the fact that the emergency regulations, particularly when the armed forces arrest for up to 24 hours, technically they don't have to give information to anyone, even to the nearest police station. So technically, this is a line between legal and illegal, because under the emergency regulations, it can also be classified as legal, which is sometimes the state might try to do that. But I always tell people, particularly if you feel that you are being followed or arrested or something like followed, or you might be under the threat of arrest. Whenever you go out, keep people informed, tell people where you're going and coming, and also always go with other people. So there's a witness if some incident happens.
Swastika, I'm just going to say that in Sinhala also. Or wait, we'll do it later. I will. Swastika, tell me, okay, we have heard of abductions happening in vehicles without number plates. This is again, it's a throwback. Yes. If it ever comes to that, even then, do we have no chance to raise protest? Because if people said nothing to do with us, and if there's no tracing mechanism, I'm asking this as having grown up in a context where people just disappeared and there was no breadcrumb to find out where they went, and the Mothers Front is still looking for people in the north. I mean, they're still protesting, and in the south and all that. So we have had that with no number plates, nothing to trace where these people ended up in. So there's nothing actually, should that happen again, God forbid, but then there's nothing we can do, right? If the state says nothing to do with us.
So there is a lot of danger in that situation repeating again. And the state of emergency is the environment on which these incidents of disappearance and all gets encouraged, because the state can simply say, we don't know what's happening. And we also don't know who has done it, because it's a state of emergency where even the armed forces and the police are abducting people. So the next step, I would say, is to pressure the parliament, because ultimately it's the 225 MPs who keep voting for the emergency and keep the emergency in existence. Because the president can declare emergency, but the parliament doesn't approve it, then the emergency lapses after 1 month. So every month the emergency comes for voting in parliament, and the parliament has to vote emergency and say that
every month it comes up every month.
It comes up every month. So when it comes up for voting, we always tell people who are conscious of these situations, and even ordinary people, because ultimately it's going to affect everyone. When disappearances start, they're not only going to be disappearing activists. Anyone whom they find irritating will go missing. So ultimately it's going to bite all of us. So pressure parliamentarians to not vote for the emergency, because once parliament does not vote for emergency automatically lapses. So if we do not want history to repeat, then we need to pressure our elected MPs to not vote for the continuation of the state of emergency.
But that gives me a very hopeless feeling, Swastika, because we've seen this parliament and we've seen they have 2/3 majority, and that nothing the president doesn't want ever gets passed. That's what the history has shown us the last few months. Apart from pressurizing say the parliament will never see it this way. They've shown us that they've never understood what the Aragalaya was about. There's nothing else, right? Which means we are caught to this for quite some time. And how long can an emergency be held?
So,
if not voted out?
If not voted out, an emergency can exist indefinitely, because we have had several, I think since independence, majority of the years of a country, I think up until 2013, and then there was a short period when there was no emergency. Then again, when the Easter Sunday came, again there was a declaration of emergency. So for the majority of our post-independence year, we have been under emergency, and we should keep in mind that every month it was voted and it was extended. So every month someone voted for it and decided that we need an emergency, even though there was no need for emergency. So yes, it is quite hopeless in terms of how the parliamentarians, whether they would listen to us or not. But ultimately they have to face an election. So parliamentarians are worried about elections. That is one thing they're worried about, whether they won't be voted to power again or not. So that is one hold we have. And of course, when an incident like this happens, I always tell people, whether the Supreme Court listens to your case or not, whether the Supreme Court dismisses a fundamental rights petition or not, is important to keep filing cases to put it on record. And the interesting thing about fundamental rights cases is that you don't need a lawyer to file these cases. Like, let's say I'm not a lawyer. Of course, this is very easier said than done, because court is a very intimidating space. And even lawyers feel intimidated going to the Supreme Court. So I can't imagine how it must be feeling for a non-lawyer. But the fundamental rights chapter does not require a person to need a lawyer to file the application. Let's say I am a non-lawyer and my fundamental rights has been violated. I have to put an affidavit and a petition into court, and the person can go and describe the situation, because a fundamental rights application is basically you go and tell the facts to court. This is what happened to me, and say my fundamental rights have been violated. So that is another thing which in the past people have used to challenge the status quo in a very indirect sense, where they kept on filing fundamental rights cases in court. And sometimes it's just a letter which they write to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has taken notice of that letter, sent it to the Legal Aid Commission, and the Legal Aid Commission has filed papers to court. So these methods of activism to fight against a state of emergency has been handled by people like people who are not lawyers in the past, to continue to challenge the state of emergency. So the more cases you file, and the more challenge you put, and the more Human Rights Commission you file, and the more you keep pressuring your MPs, at one point it's going to become impossible for them to keep this status quo. So it's a long route, but this is the only way in which I see where the situation can be challenged.
Not to be resigned and not to accept this as the status quo, but to keep challenging no matter how difficult, how long it takes. Yes, that I got. Tell me, Swastika, what is the role of trade unions within that? Because I know you are very active within the trade union space as well. And in fact, you have been agitating for reform much before the Aragalaya came on, on basic, either the fishermen or the, the other worker sectors, and you've been continuously agitating for reform. And you are officially someone in the trade union sector, if I'm correct, Swastika?
I'm the Deputy General Secretary of the United Federation of Labor.
Right.
The Commercial and Industrial Workers Union, which is part of the United Federation of Labor.
Right. Tell me, what is the role of trade unions in emergency? What happens to them, or your activism within that sphere?
Emergency particularly affects trade unions in the government sector. In Sri Lanka, the public sector trade unions are the strongest, because the state, for whatever reason, apart from certain incidents, have allowed workers or public sector workers to join trade unions. So you have larger numbers in the public sector than in the private sector. Private sector, of course, since the opening of the economy in 1978, has continuously suffered in terms of the workers. The public sector has used tools like union busting and intimidating workers and so on to weaken trade unions in the private sector. But in the public sector, more often than not, union busting and things like that are not done by the state.
For example, we have the FUTA, which is like,
yes.
Just to go back again, is it allowed in a democracy for the private sector to bash trade unions? I mean, do they have space to do that? Or is it not upheld by law that they allow trade unions to be active in private sector, in the private sector?
In the law, trade union rights is a sanctified right, and every worker has a right to join trade union. And if a person is dismissed or intimidated because he or she joins a trade union, then it is an offense. You can be punished under the law. But the law is implemented so weakly that the companies don't really mind the law, and they continue to dismiss workers for joining unions. And private sector has there's a statistics which says less than 10% of the workers are in fact form part of trade unions, despite the fact that it's a protected right. So that happens in the private sector, because the private sector, the companies are very strong, and they can actually trample trade unions and trample members for joining trade unions, and they don't face any consequences. In the public sector, the government more or less respects trade union rights, except when workers go on strike. And what government does is it uses the provision called the Essential Services Act. And what it does is the president declares a service to be essential service. For instance, doctors, it declares the health service to be essential service. Once a service is declared to be essential service, then it becomes impossible to strike. The worker has to report back to work, otherwise he can be fired from the job.
And this, forgive me, this is under emergency law or normal law?
This exists under normal law also, okay. But particularly under emergency, they have brought this essential services provision, where they can declare, an authorized person can declare a service to be essential service. And once a service is declared to be essential service, you can't, let's say you go on a strike or something, you can be technically fired from your job, and it becomes an offense also now. And you can't even organize a strike, or you can't even organize a protest, and even that can be construed as an offense under emergency. So apart from the normal law and apart from the Essential Services Act and so on, the emergency also specifically makes provisions for essential services, which is going to affect trade union, and which is going to affect trade union action, because literally you can't take trade union action. The moment you take trade union action, the president or that authorized person can declare that service to be essential service, and essentially whatever action you take can become illegal. So in that sense, it's going to affect.
Just tell me now, Joseph Stalin was released on bail yesterday. On what grounds was he taken? Because he's one of the well-known trade union leaders of teachers. So let's, through that example, tell me, Swastika, on what grounds was he taken in?
So he was not taken under emergency regulation, because he was taken by the Fort Police, and then he was produced within that 20, not within, he was produced after 24 hours, but the police wanted to produce him within that 24 hours, and they wanted to stick to that rule, but of course they violated that rule. But he was not taken under emergency. The arrest of Joseph Stalin is of course a political arrest, because the main charge against him was that on the 28th of May, he has gone for a protest in violation of a court order. So that court order came on maybe on the 27th of May. So the violation happened on 28th of May. Now we are sitting in August. So despite the fact that the police said, we are arresting you for a violation of court order, the lawyers appearing for him said that the police did not act in good faith when they arrested Joseph Stalin, because if they really wanted to arrest him for the violation of court order, they would have done that in May. So the application which was made by lawyers is that one of the applications, several applications made, one of the applications is the lawyers said that it was the police acting with a bad intention to arrest Joseph Stalin. So therefore they traced back to this 28th of May, found that he has not, which the police thought he has not respected the court order, and they have produced him to court.
Okay, why did he get a court order not to go for a protest?
So what happens is, when there is a protest, let's say tomorrow there is going to be a protest, the police has a right to go before court and ask for a restraining order or an injunction on that protest, and say that this protest is going to cause public nuisance or some kind of public harm. So therefore, they will ask the court, can you give us a restraining order or what is called the injunction on this protest? And the court, depending on the situation, sometimes grants an injunction and sometimes doesn't. So in this case, the Fort courts, the Fort magistrate granted a restraining order for the protesters to not take a particular route. So that route was specified in the order. The information we are receiving is many of the protesters did not take that route and they took a different route, but that's like something which has to be argued in court. But usually police have the right to go before court and get a restraining order on a protest or a rally or something which is going to happen. Under the emergency regulation, you don't have to go to court. The president can simply declare a protest to be, or kind of ban public gatherings, and that would be legal under emergency. So that is the other thing which the emergency regulation does. It takes away the need or the requirement for law enforcement, including police, the armed forces, the president, not the president, but the police and the armed forces, to go to court. It takes the requirement from courts, whether it be in terms of protest, whether it be in terms of arrest and detention. It takes a lot of power away from court under the state of emergency, and that is also very dangerous.
Okay, so right. That also I think we should emphasize. So now the emergency can suddenly say, you can't have this protest, and then it becomes law. Yes. So we need to be aware, I think, of those dangers as well. Okay, so Swastika, within this, the only way we can deal with what's happening now is to make people aware of what is in force currently, try to persuade their representatives in parliament to say, please, within this, in 2022, let's not get back to like 3 decades ago. And also maybe keep fighting in court, in any place you can, to appeal what is happening now. Now, one thing, the last question is, one thing that we saw in the Aragalaya was that every time somebody was arrested, there were about 100 lawyers appearing in court, bona fide, just absolutely, what do you say? What is the term you use for free?
Pro bono.
See, I'm very, very bad with this legal term. Everybody just turned up. Is the same commitment there now, you think, Swastika, of people to back these people who wanted a change in the system, like a more transparent, a more fair, a more equitable change? Is the support still standing from maybe the BASL? What do you think? I know you can't speak for them, but what is your idea about it?
So my personal observation, this entirely my personal observation, is that the lawyers' support was declining, particularly soon after Rani Wickramasinghe came to power. Several lawyers pulled out of what they were initially supporting, and they gave various reasons. But the political situation was that they pulled out of doing these free cases, particularly for Aragalaya people and so on. And they have, in our professional ethics and so on, they have absolute, in terms of, you look at the profession strictly, they have a right to do that. But recently, around maybe last week, there was a lawyers gathering, and at least 100 lawyers only from Colombo participated. And there was a declaration signed by all of these lawyers that they would appear, assist, fight for, particularly arrests which are happening, which goes to, it pricks the conscience of lawyers when arrests happen illegally. Like, for instance, when boys are being abducted and protesters are being targeted, then there was a declaration that these lawyers would work towards the rule of law, the upholding of the rule of law and things like that. So there was a kind of a consensus which was reached amongst lawyers in Colombo, because it was outside lawyers could not come, so it was only Colombo lawyers, and particularly president's counsels and senior lawyers also participated in this event. So there's a shift afterwards, particularly because of what's happening in terms of emergency regulations and the arrest and so on. See, after that conference, there has been a bit of a shift in terms of lawyers' participation and lawyers appearing for protesters. But still, it's not as strong as what it used to be when the Aragalaya started.
Yes, nevertheless, I always felt every time I saw the legal, because no matter how much we protest, change needs to come within the legal infrastructure. And here we are all flummoxed by the fact that there is a majority in parliament who would simply, for their own protection or whatever reason, they may not change their minds. So it's through the legal system that we need to fight. And the protest at Galle Face showed the need for things to happen. And every time something hurt them, the fact that lawyers appeared, and as you say now, if there is a consensus reached among some lawyers to always help, for me, that is a very, very positive sign, and maybe the most essential thing needed right now. Because what's going to happen now is that we need to know the legal structures of what's going on. And for that reason, Swastika, may I thank you very much. Because for people like me, I'm pretty sure others know law much more than I do, to get an idea of what this is. At one point, I also wanted to ask what a militarized government is. Is it even worse than what you call emergency, Swastika? What is a militarized government? Shall we just get to that before we stop as well? Because we haven't gone there yet. But what does that mean?
Okay.
Yeah.
Militarized government is when what is called the martial law, where it is the military has a separate set of law which applies to them. For instance, if there is a violation of the military law, then they are not produced before normal courts. They have something called martial courts, and they are produced before that. So the military has its own set of laws and regulations, because the military is supposed to be a force which is fighting a state of war. So in a war, the rules which apply in a war is not similar to a war which applies in times of civilian administration. So usually when military law is imposed, it usually happens through an illegal takeover, an illegal coup or something. And that's how usually military law is set in place, because under the democratic system, the constitutional system, even in a state of emergency, we don't call that military rule. We call that emergency, but it's not military rule. So if a military rule or a militarization comes in, it's usually through a takeover of power. But what our government has been doing, particularly since the Rajapaksas took over, what the government has been doing is appointing military officials to civilian bodies. They become secretaries of government institutions. Military is handed over certain functions. Military is handed over the duty to print driving license and so on. They function under civilian law, but they are military people who are actually doing it. The problem with that is the military has a particular kind of training. They don't have training to administer civilian governance. They have a training under the military law. The problem with bringing military to do civilian function is that they, even despite the fact that they are governed by normal law, they act as if they're still inside, they are governed by military rules and regulations. So they have no respect in terms of fundamental rights. They have no respect in terms of civilian authority, and they have no respect in terms of people, because they're always in a state of war, which they don't have to be, but that is the psychology, that is the training. So we are not in a military government, and there is nothing called military government if we strictly interpret the law. But Sri Lanka has been moving towards a situation where there is a lot of military involvement and militarization in, let's say, education, in, let's say, land administration, in terms of administering essential services. The military is deployed, and thereby creating a situation where it amounts to military rule.
Swastika, though they work in civilian spaces, not though, if they work in civilian spaces, they are under the civilian law, right? So they are only under martial law if they are in war. But say they are working within, building or whatever, the sites or whatever, then they are under civilian law. Am I correct?
So it's an interesting situation where the military or the armed forces are governed by a particular set of rules and regulations, military law for themselves. So for them, they are governed.
Even if they are doing administrative work?
Yes, even if they are doing administrative work, they still come in as a military officer. So for them, the laws of the military or the rules of the martial law, which I'm not familiar with, that applies to them. But they are functioning in a civilian setup. So they have to follow the rules of let's say, they can't for instance, arrest someone, because they don't have powers to do that under normal speed. So they are governed by, they themselves, personally, they're governed by the military rules and codes of conduct, but they are put in a situation where now they have to follow the civilian law.
All right, so they have to follow the civilian law.
They have to follow the civilian law, but because they themselves are used to following this particular situation of the military law, there is always a extremely gray line where the law is where the law gets violated all the time, because psychologically it's not the civilian law which is in their head.
Right. So they are
like a police.
What is applicable to them personally is one law, but they have to act within another set of laws. So I see the balance there. Right.
And that is why the emergency regulation comes in and gives the military certain powers to act under the so-called civilian law, but it is still the emergency law. So it creates a lot of legal confusion also in terms of what are the parameters of the powers given to the military in a civilian setup.
Exactly, but emergency would surely move it more closer to what they're used to.
Exactly.
Okay. Swastika, would you allow me to kind of summarize this in Sinhala? And I want to do it with you because me doing something legal alone is dangerous. Do you understand roughly Sinhala?
Yes, I understand. Yeah.
So if I get something completely wrong, stop me, because to do legal stuff, for me, like an art person, is not very safe. I will only summarize what I think is important.
Right.
Mama Swastika, මේ නීතිඥ ස්වස්තිකාගෙන් අහපු එක දෙයක් තමයි මම ප්‍රධාන දේවල් විතරක් කියන්නම් සිංහලෙන්. මේ වෙලාවේ හදිසි නීතිය යටතේ වෙන්න පුළුවන් ප්‍රශ්න වලට අපි මුලින්ම ඉංග්‍රීසියෙන් කතා කරා ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදය සහ හදිසි නීතිය දැමූ ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදය අතර වෙනස කරුණාකරලා පුළුවන් නම් ඒක ඉංග්‍රීසියෙන් අහන්න. මොකද ඒක දිග දෙයක්, ඒක ඕන තැනකින් කියවලා ඉගෙන ගන්නත් පුළුවන්. මම අයගෙන් අහපු එක දෙයක් තමයි මේ හදිසි නීතිය තුල අතීතයේ යම් දේවල් සිදු වුණා නම් ඒකට යම් දෙයක් දැන් උදාහරණයක් වශයෙන් අත්අඩංගුවට ගන්න පුළුවන්ද කියලා. දැන් ස්වස්තිකා කිව්වේ හදිසි නීතියට පෙර ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදයක හමුවීමේ අයිතිය තියෙනවා, කතා කිරීමේ අයිතිය තියෙනවා. එතකොට දැන් Galle Face Aragalaya වගේ දෙයක උන දෙයකට පිටිපස්සට ගිහිල්ලා අත්අඩංගුවට ගන්න බෑ කියලා. කියපු තව දෙයක් තමයි හදිසි නීතියේ මොකක්ද වරද්දක් කියලා සලකා බලන්නේ කියන එක ඒ අවස්ථාව අනුව වෙනස් කරලා ගැසට් කරලා. You have to gazette it, right? Swastika?
They have already gazetted.
Yes.
They have gazetted the emergency regulations in July 2022.
Exactly, and that is a case by case thing. They can put false what they think is suitable for that.
Yes, yes.
Right.
Yes, yes.
ඒ වෙලාවේ වැරද්ද මොකද්ද කියලා ගැසට් කරාට පස්සේ ඒ වැරදි මොනවද කියලා ඒ කාලෙන් කාලෙට වෙනස් කරලා ගැසට් කරන්න පුළුවන් කියලා කිව්වා. එතකොට මම අයගෙන් අහුවාම ඉස්සර කරපු දේවල් වලට අත්අඩංගුවට හදිසි නීතියට ගන්න පුළුවන්ද කියලා අය කිව්වා බෑ කියලා. හැබැයි දැන් මේ වෙලාවේ හදිසි නීතිය යටතේ යම් වැරද්දක් කියලා පිළිගත්ත දෙයකට ඕනි වෙලාවක ඕනි කෙනෙක්ට ඒක වැරද්දක් කියලා ඕනි කෙනෙක්ට නෙමෙයි මිලිටරි කෙනෙක්ට පොලිසියට හරි කාට හරි වැරද්දක් කියලා පෙනුනොත් අත්අඩංගුවට ගන්න නීතියක් තියෙනවා කියලා. ඇය දුන්න උදාහරණය තමයි දැන් බොයිෆ්‍රෙන්ඩ් කෙනෙක් එක්ක හරි Galle Face ගිහිලා අයිස්ක්‍රීම් කන වෙලාවෙවත් කාට හරි කියන්නේ පොලිසිය එක්කෙනෙක්ට ඔවුන්ව අත්අඩංගුවට ගන්න පුළුවන් කියලා අර මේ what is it in what did you call that
called, it's called indecency, acting in an indecent manner.
You wouldn't know what that asabya ekada man danne ek mage niti danuma
usually it's used usually it's used against people of same sex relations.
Exactly.
But yeah, I don't know how to frame that phrase.
I have a see my niti, the thing is asabya hari මොකක් හරි වෙන්න ඇත asabya නීතියද මන් දන්නේ. ඒ වගේ හිතුනොත් අත්අඩංගුවට ගන්න පුළුවන් කියලා. මොකද හදිසි නීතිය යටතේ පුද්ගලයෙක්ට මිලිටරි සහ ඒ නීතියේ ඉන්න පුද්ගලයෙක්ට ඕනම දෙයක් මේක නීතිය කඩනවා කියලා ගන්න අවස්ථාවක් තියෙනවා. ඒකින්ද ටිකක් භයානක තත්වයක් එන්න පුළුවන් කියලා. ඊට පස්සේ මම ඇගෙන් ඇහුවා මෙහිම තත්ත්වය අනුව මොනවද මොකද දැන් අපි මේ දවස්වල අත්අඩංගුවට ගැනීම දැකලා තියෙනවා මොනවද කරන්න පුළුවන් කියලා. අත්අඩංගුවට ගැනීම මම ප්‍රශ්න දෙකකින් ඇහුවා. එකක් නීති අනුකූලව පොලිසියේ නිලධාරියෙක් එක්ක ආර්මිකේ නිලධාරියෙක් ගිහිල්ලා අත්අඩංගුවට ගත්තොත් පොලිසියට ගියාට පස්සේ ස්වස්තිකා පොලිසියට එන්න කියනවා. එහෙම. එතකොට ස්වස්තිකා කිව්වේ කරුණාකරලා යනකොට නීතිඥයෙක් පුළුවන් නම් ගෙනියන්න නැත්නම් යාළුවෙක් හරි ගෙනියන්න තනියම යන්න එපා කියන එක කිව්වා. මොකද එතකොට වැරලක්වත් අත්අඩංගුවට ගත්තොත් ෆෝන් එක හරි යාළුවට දෙන්න පුළුවන් මානව හිමිකම් මේ කමිසමට කරුණාකරලා කියන්න කියලා ස්වස්තිකා කිව්වේ. ඔබව අත්අඩංගුවට ගත්තොත් හැමෝටම කියලා තියන්න මොකක්ද උනේ කියලා. මොකද අපි එන්නේ එකපාරෙන් අතුරුදහන් වුණ මිනිසුන් හිටිය රටක. උතුරේ දෙමළ මිනිසුන් ඔක්කො දකුණේ සිංහල JVP කාලේ තරුණයා එකපාරෙන් ගියාමයි. දැන් අපි තවම මදර්ස් වලට අම්මලාගේ මේ සංවිධාන තියෙනවා තවම තමන්ගේ දරුවන්ට උනේ මොකද්ද කියලා දන්නේ නැති. ඒ වගේ තත්වයකින් ආපු අපිට දැන් අය කියන්නේ පොලිසියට යනවා නම් එක්ක නීතිඥයෙක් ගෙනියන්න නැත්නම් යාළුවෙක් හරි ගෙනියන්න තනියම යන්න එපා. ඔබට පැය 24ක් වගේ තුල යන්න. හැබැයි ඔබට පුළුවන් වෙලාවක මේ කවුරු හරි එක්ක යන්න සහ හිරේ බලංගු දැම්මොත් කරුණාකරලා මානව හිමිකම් කොමිසමට කියන්න කියලා. මම ඊට පස්සේ ආගෙන් තව එකක් ඇහුවා මේක ටිකක් මට භයානකයි කියලා හිතෙන එකක්. ඒ අත්අඩංගුවට ගැනීම කෙරෙන්නේ නීත්‍යානුකූලව පෙනී නොසිටින පිරිසකගෙන් කියලා. ඒ කියන්නේ සිවිල් ඇඳුම පිටින් එකපාරෙන් වාහනයක දාගෙන ගෙනියන්න පුළුවන්. මං හිතන්නේ ඊයේ උනේ එහෙම සිද්ධියක්. දැන් එතන තත්ත්වය භයානක බව අයත් පිළිගත්ත. මොකද ඕන වෙලාවක රජයකට කියන්න පුළුවන් මේ අපි කරපු දෙයක් නෙමෙයි. අපි දන්නේ මේ පාතාල ලෝකේ වෙන්න පුළුවන් කියලා එහෙම කියන්න පුළුවන්. එහෙම වෙන්නත් පුළුවන්. හැබැයි එහෙම වුණහම මොකද්ද තියෙන තත්ත්වය කියලා. දැන් එතන නීත්‍යානුකූල මාර්ගයකට යන්න බෑ. මොකද අපි කවුරුත් දන්නේ නැහැනේ මොකක්ද උනේ කියලා. දැන් ඔබ මගේ වයසේ නම් JBP කාලේ උන මේ ගොඩක් දේවල් ඔය මට්ටමින් උන බව දන්නවා. දැන් ඇය කිව්වේ ඒකට තියෙන මේ කාටවත් පිළියමක් නැහැ. හැබැයි ඔබ යම් දෙයකින් අරගලයට වගේ සම්බන්ධ වෙලා හිටියොත් හැමතිස්සෙම තනි වෙන්නේ නැතුව ඉන්න බලන්න කියලා. ඇය කියන්නේ කොහේ හරි ගියොත් දෙතුන් දෙනෙක්වත් එකට යන්න. මොකද එහෙම ගිහිල්ලා වාහනයක දානවා නම් වාහනේ නම්බරය බලා ගන්න පුළුවන් නේ. කාට හරි කියන්න පුළුවන් මෙන්න මේ නම්බරයෙන් ගත්තේ ওই නම්බරයක් කියන එක හොයා ගන්න පුළුවන්. සහ මොකක් හරි වුණොත් වටපිට ඉන්න අයට ඒක දැක ගන්න පුළුවන්. ඉතින් ඇය කියන්නේ පුළුවන් තරම් තනියම නොයා ඉන්න එක. මේ වාතාවරණය ටිකක් සංසිඳනකම් මේ සමූහ වශයෙන් එහෙ මෙහෙ අනේක වඩා ඇඟට හොඳයි කියලා ඒ කියන්නේ අපි හැමෝම බලාපොරොත්තු වෙන්නේ මේ తත්වය බරපතල නොවි සමාදාන වෙයි කියලා. හැබැයි එතකම් මොකද්ද වෙන්නේ කියලා දැනගන්නකම් කණ්ඩායම් වශයෙන් යන්න කියලා. එතකොට මම අයගෙන් ඇහුවා එතකොට මේ කවදා හරි ආයේ මෙහෙම නොවුනොත් හොඳයි නම්බර් ප්ලේට් එකක්වත් නැති නම්බරයක් නැති වාහනත් එන්න පටන් ගත්තොත් මොකද කියලා. ඉතින් අර සමූහය වශයෙන් කණ්ඩායම් වශයෙන් ඉන්නකොට එතන මේ පිරිස් බලයේ හින්දා මේ දැනුම ගිහින් මාධ්‍යයට ගිහින් අපි මේ මානව හිමිකම් කොමිසමට ඒක කියන්න පුළුවන් වීමෙන් යම් ශක්තියක් මේ පැත්තටත් ලැබෙන්න පුළුවන් කියලා. ඒක මං හිතන්නේ අපි හැමෝම මතක තියාගත්තොත් හොඳයි මේ මොකද්ද වෙන්නේ කියලා දැනගන්න. අනිත් එක ඇය කිව්වේ තව කරන්න පුළුවන් දෙයක් තමයි මේ හදිසි නීතිය කියන එක ජනාධිපතිට දාන්න පුළුවන් වුණාට ඒක පාර්ලිමේන්තුවෙන් අනුමත වෙන්න ඕනේ ඇත්තටම ක්‍රියාත්මක වෙන්න කියලා දින 14ක් තුල. අනිත් එක තමයි පාර්ලිමේන්තුවේ සිටින ඔබේ නියෝජිතයන්ට දැන් මේක වැඩක් වෙයිද මන්දා ඔවුන්ට මේ කිව්වොත් අපි කන්නා කරලා මේකෙන් අපි නැවත ඉතාම කළු වකවානුවකට යන්න ඉඩ තියෙනවා මේක දැන් අයින් කරන්න. මොකද මේකෙන් හානි වෙන්නේ අපි හැමෝම වෙනුවෙන් වඩා සාධාරණ සමාජයක් වෙනුවෙන් හිටගත්ත පිරිසකට කියලා. අපි හැමෝම හිටගත්තේ හේතුවට තමයි අතීතයේ උනත්. දැන් නැවත ඒක නැවත වෙන්න දෙන්න එපා කියලා ඔබේ නියෝජිතයන්ට කියලා ඔවුන්ට පාර්ලිමේන්තුවේ මේක අයින් කරන්න පුළුවන්. මොකද ස්වස්තිකා කියපු එක දෙයක් මම මේක දැනන් හිටියේ නෑ. හදිසි නීතිය කියන එක මාසෙන් මාසෙට අනුමත වෙන්න ඕනෙලු. ඒ කියන්නේ හැම මාසයකම මේක ඇවිල්ලා අනුමත වෙලා තමයි හදිසි නීතිය රටක ක්‍රියාත්මක වෙන්නේ. ඉතින් ඒකින්ද අපිට අවස්ථාවක් තියෙනවා හැම තිස්සෙම බලයක් යොදන්න කරුණාකරලා මේක අයින් කරන්න කියලා. මොකද මේ වගේ හදිසි පැහැර ගැනීම සිදුවෙන්න ලේසි ගොඩක් මේ වගේ තත්ත්වයක් යටතේ. ස්වස්තික තව කියපු දෙයක් මම සම්පූර්ණයෙන්ම එකඟ වෙන නීතියට පිටත මිනිසුන් පැහැර ගන්න ගත්තොත් අපිට ටික කාලයක් ඉන්න පුළුවන් වෙයි යා හොඳයි මේක මට සම්බන්ධ නෑ කියලා. හැබැයි අපි ඒකට ඉඩ දුන්නොත් කොයි වෙලාවෙ ඕනෙම එක්කෙනෙක්ව එහෙම ගෙනිච්චට හඬ නගන්න පුද්ගලයෝ නැති වෙන්න පුළුවන්. ඒකින්ද සියලු දේම නීතිය තුල ක්‍රියාත්මක වෙන්න එක ඉතා වැදගත් කියලා මමත් මෙතන අවධාරණයෙන් කියන්න පුළුවන්. එතකොට හඬක් නගන එක වැදගත්. ඇය කියපු තව දෙයක් තමයි එහෙම කවුරු හරි ගියොත් එහෙම කවුරු හරි ගෙනihin තිබ්බොත් දිගින් දිගටම මානව හිමිකම් කොමිෂමට ගිහිල්ලා නීතිය ඉදිරියට ගිහිල්ලා මම හිතන්නේ ස්වස්තිකා මම ඔබ කිව්වේ මානව හිමිකම් නඩුවක් දාන්න ඔබ ලෝයර් කෙනෙක්ම වෙන්න ඕනේ නැහැ කියලා. You said even a non-lawyer can actually make a case.
You don't have to be a lawyer.
තමුන්ට හරින් මානව හිමිකම් නීතියකට දෙනේ හිටින්න පුළුවන්. ලෝයර් කෙනෙක් නොවුනත් ඒක ලේසි නෑ. ඇත් කිව්ව මේක ලේසි නෑ. ලෝයර් කෙනෙක් නීතිඥයෙක් උනත් ඒක ටිකක් බය හිතෙන දෙයක්. හැබැයි පුළුවන්. ඒතර අපි දිගින් දිගටම මේක නිහඬව බාර ගන්න නැතුව අපේ ඉල්ලීම් කරොත් දැන් මේක සාමාන්‍ය තත්වයක් නෙමෙයි අපිට මේකට ඇබ්බැහි වෙන්න හොඳ නෑ. මොකද මේකට ඇබ්බැහි වුණොත් අපි හැමෝගෙම සිවිල් ජීවිතයට වෙන විශාල තර්ජනයක්. ඕනෙක් කෙනෙක්ව අයින් කරන්න පුළුවන් නම් ඒකෙහිඳ දිගින් දිගටම හඬක් නගන එක වැදගත් කියලා අය පෙන්වා දුන්නා. මම එතකොට ওই කාරණා මතක තියාගන්න එක වැදගත්. මම ඇයගෙන් ඇහුවා මේ ඉවර වෙන්නේ ඉස්සල්ලා වෘත්තීය සමිති ගැන. වෘත්තීය සමිතිවල භූමිකාව මොකක්ද කියලා මේ ස්වස්තිකා කියන්නේ වෘත්තීය සමිති මේ කියන්නේ ඒකේ it's a parent body, is it Swastika that you're in?
It's a trade union, commercial and industrial union.
But it's a parent body, right? Is it like a particular trade
It's not a branch union. It's a parent body. Yes.
Exactly. අය ඒකේ මේ deputy president
Deputy General Secretary.
ඒකේ මේ නියෝජ්‍ය මට්ටමේ
No, Deputy General Secretary. I don't know how to say that.
This is where I suddenly forget the technical term is important. අය බුද්ධිය සමිති ඉතාම ක්‍රියාශීලී සමාජිකාවක් සහ මේ අය කියන්නේ ඔය trade union කියන එක ගැන අපි කතා කරා emergency law එකෙන් ඒකටත් සමහර විට බලපෑම් තියෙන්න පුළුවන්. මම ඇයගෙන් අහුවා ජෝසප් ස්ටාලින් ගැන. දැන් ඔහුව හිරේට දාලා තියන්නේ අර නීත්‍යානුකූල නොවන ජන හමුවක් ප්‍රොටෙස්ට් එකක් අරගලයකට ඔහු එතෙන්ට ගියා කියන එක මත දැන් ඔය අරගල සම්බන්ධව මේකත් ඔළුවේ තියාගන්න එක වැදගත්. සාමාන්‍ය ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදී වාතාවරණයකදී යම් හමු වෙන තැන් හමු වෙන්න එපා කියලා පොලිසියට පුළුවන් නඩුවක් නීතියට කියලා මෙතන හමු වෙන්න එපා කියලා නීතියක් ගේන්න. පොලිසිය එතෙන්ට ගිහිල්ලා නීතිය ගේන්න ඕනේ. හැබැයි ඉමර්ජන්සි හදිසි නීතිය යටතේ ඕනේ වෙලාවක ජනාධිපතිට හරි කාට හරි කියන්න පුළුවන් මෙතන හමු වෙන්න බෑ කියලා. දැන් එතන හමු වෙන්න බෑ කිව්වොත් එතන හමු වීම නීතිය කැඩීමක් ලෙස ගන්න පුළුවන්. දැන් ස්ටාලින්ව මං හිතන්නේ අත්අඩංගුවට අරන් තියෙන එක එතන වෙන ප්‍රශ්න තියෙනවා. ඒක ඒගොල්ලෝ දැන් කතා කරමින් ඉන්නේ. හැබැයි හදිසි නීතිය යටතේ එකපාරින් මෙතන හමු වීම වරද්දක් කියලා කරොත් ඩික්ලෙයාර් කරොත් එහෙම අපි මෙතන හමු වීම වැරද්දක් කියලා කරාට පස්සේ හමු වෙන එක නීතිය කැඩීමක් කියලා සැලකෙන්න පුළුවන්. ඉතින් ඔය වගේ දේවල් දැනගන්න ඉන්න එක වැදගත්. සහ ස්වස්තිකා කියපු අර precautions පරිස්සම් වීම. ඒ කියන්නේ මේ ඔබ අරගලයේ හිටියා නම් එකට මේ බය කිරීමට නෙමෙයි හැබැයි දැනගැනීම මම හිතන්නේ වැදගත්. සාමූහිකයක් වශයෙන් ඉන්න එක මොකක් හරි වුණොත් වහාම දන්නන එක නීතිඥයෙක්ට මම ඇහුවා නීතිඥයෝ අරගලය කාලේ ඉතාම ප්‍රබල සහයෝගයක් දුන්නන් ගොඩක් පිට අරගලය ශක්තිමත් වෙන්න හේතුව ඒ නීතිඥ සහාය වෙන්න පුළුවන්. මොකද අපි මොකක් වුණත් අපි ඔක්කොම දන්න දෙයක් තමයි කොච්චර අරගල කරත් කොච්චර අපි වෙනසකට ඉල්ලුවත් ඒක අවශ්‍යයි මෙහෙම වෙනසක් අවශ්‍යයි කියලා පෙන්වන්නේ අපි අරගලය කරොත් විතරයි. සද්ද නැතුව නිකන් හිටියොත් ඒක කාටවත් තේන්නේ නැහැ. ඇත්ත වෙනස වෙන්නේ නීතිය තුලින් කියන එක අපි ඔක්කොම දන්න ක්‍රියාවක්. එතකොට ඒ අරගලය මෙහෙම වෙනසකට අවශ්‍යතාවය පෙන්වුවාම ඒක කරන්නේ නීතිමය බලයෙන් කියන එක දන්න හින්දා නීතිඥවරුන්ගේ සහාය ඉතාම අවශ්‍යයි. එතකොට දැන් නීතිඥයන්ගේ සහාය වෙනස් වෙලාද කියලා මම ඇයෙන් ඇහුවා. ඇය කිව්වා රනිල් වික්‍රමසිංහ බලයට ආවට පස්සේ යම් තාක් දුරට සමහර නීතිඥයෝ මේකෙන් ඉවත් වුණා. මොකද එක මේ හේතු තියෙන්න පුළුවන් ඕන් අරගලයට සහාය දුන්න. හැබැයි ළඟදී ආය නැවත පොඩි එක්රැස් වීමක් දකින්න තියෙනවා සහ ළඟදී lawyers-ලා එකතු වෙලා 100 දෙනෙක් විතර about 100 no
about 100 that day
කොළඹ ඉන්න ඈතට එන්න බැරි හින්දා කොළඹ ඉන්න 100ක් විතර එකතු වෙලා මේකට අපි මේ වගේ පැහැර ගැනීම අනීතික පැහැර ගැනීම සිදු වෙනකොට ඒකට සහාය දෙන්න ඕන් කැප වෙලා ඉන්නවා කියලා සීනියර් සහ ගොඩක් lawyers-ලා එකඟතාවයකට ආවා කියලා අය කිව්වා. මොකද අපි දැන් ඉන්නේ මේක මම කියන දෙයක් අපි දැන් ඉන්නේ ඊටාම තීරණාත්මක සංධියක. අපිට දැනුයි පේන්නේ අර අරගලය කරාම එක්කෝ ආණ්ඩුව ඒක තේරුම් අරන් ඒක අනුව වෙනස් කරන්න හදනවද නැත්නම් ඒක මර්ධනය කරලා නැවත අර තිබ්බ විදිහකටම දශක ගානකට පෙර තිබ්බ ඊටාම මේ දැඩි ඊටාම ප්‍රචණ්ඩකාරී මාවතකට නැවත යනවාද කියන එක තීරණය වෙන්නේ මෙන්න මේ කාලේ ගොඩක් අය හඬ නගනවා. මම දන්නවා ස්වස්තිකා දිගටම ඇය අරගලයටත් පෙර සිට සමානාත්මතාවය ගැන කතා කරපු එක්කෙනෙක්. වෘත්තීය සමිති තුලින් අරගලයට ඉතා බොහෝ කාලයකට පෙර වෘත්තීය සමිති තුලින් අය හඬ නගපු කෙනෙක්. දැනුත් අය හඬ නගනවා. දැනුත් මං හිතන්නේ මේ වෙන පැහැර ගැනීම ගැන අය මැදිහත් ක්‍රියා කරනවා. මේ මොහොත දැනුමේ මොහොතයි. අපි දැනගන්න ඕනේ මොකද්ද වෙන්නේ කියන එක. යම් දෙයක දැන් මම අද ස්වස්තිකාට කතා කිරීමේ නීතිය ගැන මට තිබ්බ අල්ප දැනුම යම් තාක් දුරට ඒකට උදව්වක් වුණා අය කියපු මේ සමහර දේවල් වලින්. Because Swastika, I think this is the moment, it's a very decisive moment because we have no idea where it's going.
Yeah.
Either the government can learn and never repeat the mistakes it made before, but they can be, I hope not, they can be stupid enough to go and repeat the same mistakes Sri Lankan history has kept on making to all ethnic communities and keep repressing, which is dangerous. So this is the moment for education, I think.
Yes.
Because we need to know what has happened, what is going on. And if you are able to get educated in any discipline that helps you understand what's going on, please do so.
Yeah.
So thank you, Swastika. My terrible lack of legal knowledge, you kind of sorted out at least a little bit. Thank you for coming and thank you for checking my translation as well. Because because it's a bilingual channel, I wouldn't ask you to repeat this in Tamil, but you're welcome to. Would you like to do that? Repeat some of the main points in Tamil, mainly Sinhala and but I think people can use it. Should you just wish to maybe at least answer the question of what you should do if at this moment, if they're under threat of being taken in, go with a lawyer, and then you said always move in a crowd. You
Hello.
Hi. If you think it won't make sense to talk in Tamil here, because I doubt that Tamil speakers listen to my channel, but what do you think? Because
I just want to say that one aspect about the precaution, because that's the most.
Yeah. I think we are getting signal problems, Swastika. Okay, I think we are getting signal problems. So what I will do is I'll wind up